Manche, or Free Trade Zone. Here you can exchange your euros for afro, the fictitious currency of this exhibition dedicated to the idea of borders, and in particular, the movement across them.
Nous avons rencontré des personnes qui ont voyagé.
We met people who have travelled, who have crossed borders, so that we can embrace the concept of flow. We don't just travel with clothes and possessions, we also travel with the imagination and the mind.
It's an adventure from Douala to Paris via Tangier, represented by maps, but also by birds. Like this West African hornbill, the emblem of the Senufo people from the same area. 14 of these birds will be dotted around the streets of Paris's Goutte d'Or neighborhood from March.
The hornbill has become a powerful symbol for us. It is an invitation to travel, but also to celebrate differences.
Other birds, such as owls and sparrows, are at the heart of work by Choul Kriesch. The Franco-Moroccan artist depicts in black and white the places she's travelled through.
For me, birds are really the symbol of unfettered travel, and they also raise the whole poetic question of borders and territories, because where are the borders in the sky?
The exhibition can be visited online for the moment. It'll cross the virtual border as soon as COVID restrictions allow.
And finally, gallery owner Kamel Mounour had already staked out his territory here in Paris with 3 branches of his art space. Now he's opening up a 4th, just a stone's throw from the River Seine. And who better to inaugurate those new digs than a duo of contemporary artists, Philippe Parreno and Daniel Burin. They've created a colourful, immersive piece to bring a little light to the dark days of winter. We'll leave you with a glimpse of that installation. Do remember our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24. A different take on the news.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Allez-y, filmez! Filmez pour l'histoire.
It's 2011 and rebellion begins sweeping across parts of North Africa and the Middle East. This is the Arab Spring. From Tunisia to Egypt, from Syria to Yemen, thousands of people defied the authorities and risked their lives to demand freedom, equality and better lives.
Confronting police who are shooting tear gas directly at them, as you can see behind me. Look at the protesters right behind me.
Relive history and the early months of the Arab Spring through the notebooks of France 24's correspondents and our reporters' stories. Catch reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
Our reporters take us deep into the Amazon rainforest to the village of Kako, where the Hmong people arrived from Indochina 40 years ago.
Ici, on a trouvé notre terre, donc la Guyane française.
There was nothing when they arrived. Everything you see is down to their hard work. Roads, schools, homes, crops.
Ils nous font vivre la Guyane avec leurs plantations, avec leurs légumes, ce qui reste très important pour nous.
Once used as backup troops by the French in the Indochina War of the 1950s, the Hmong people have successfully integrated into Guyana's multi-ethnic society. Join us to discover these former refugees and their crucial role in their adopted homeland. In Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Myanmar's population continues to protest against last week's military coup, with several ethnic minorities now joining swelling crowds. This as Joe Biden announces sanctions against the regime. More on that coming up. Donald Trump's impeachment trial is underway in the US Senate, with video and audio files played by prosecution. They are aiming to demonstrate the former president incited the mob who besieged the US Capitol on the 6th of January. And Belarus strongman Alexander Lukashenko says his country has fought off a foreign blitzkrieg. Now, he made those remarks while addressing supporters at a rally. We'll hear more from our correspondent, Gulliver Cragg. Thanks for watching France 24. I'm James Creedon. Now, for the 6th straight day, demonstrators in Myanmar are braving a government ban on gatherings of more than 4 people. They continue to protest against the country's military coup and demand a return of Aung San Suu Kyi and her ruling party. The demonstrations come after another wave of arrests and amid fears amongst activists that further state repression could be coming. Now, that resistance to the coup received a major boost from abroad from President Joe Biden, who ordered new sanctions and promised more measures to come. Cole Stangler has the details.
Gathering in downtown Yangon and in a handful of cities across the country, protesters were back on the streets Thursday, showing their opposition to the military coup. Among the demonstrators, men donning skirts to draw international attention, and members of ethnic minorities, including the Karen group. But the 6th consecutive day of protests also followed a new wave of arrests, according to an official from the party of ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Overnight, authorities detained Kyaw Tsin Sway, a close aide to the former leader, as well as at least 4 others linked to her deposed civilian government.
Seems to be a sort of second wave of arrests from the military after those initial arrests on February 1st when they launched the coup. I think it's important to note that these are arbitrary detentions under international law and illegal. It seems that they have been targeting election officials as well as political leaders and activists across the country.
Burmese officials have not commented on the latest arrests. In the meantime, concern is growing among NGOs and activists that the military government is preparing a crackdown on the internet and social media.
The US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping held their first telephone call as leaders, with Biden insisting on a free and open Indo-Pacific as a priority for his administration. Xi Jinping warned the US President that confrontation between the two countries would be a disaster for both. Earlier we spoke to Charles Pellegrin in Beijing about that phone conversation.
Well, it definitely seems like it was a bit of a tough conversation, but a conversation nonetheless, because there hadn't been a phone call between the two heads of states of these countries since March 2020. So that, in some ways, is progress. Joe Biden obviously bringing up the difficult issues with regards to China, meaning repression in Hong Kong, the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, or in general China's aggressiveness in the Indo-Pacific region, especially with regards to Taiwan. And the Chinese statements about this phone call suggest that Xi Jinping Jinping defended China's policies as a matter of sovereignty, saying that these are internal matters of China's. This is basically just China's business. Xi Jinping also calling on the United States to manage the disputes with China and to work towards cooperation, saying that confrontation between the two countries would be a disaster both for the bilateral relationship but for the international community as a whole. So what would this cooperation look like, and in what areas would this cooperation take place? Joe Biden mentioned the fight against climate change, the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also nuclear proliferation. But there again, this is a question that needs to be asked: is cooperation possible if, as a condition to this cooperation, some Chinese officials are saying that China's sovereignty and China's internal affairs need to be respected?
Now, the trial of the former US President Donald Trump is now well underway in the Senate. He's the first former leader to face an impeachment trial after leaving office. He's been charged with incitement of insurrection for allegedly encouraging his supporters to storm the Capitol building on the 6th of January. Now, during this first full day of arguments yesterday, prosecutors said that the evidence shows Donald Trump was no innocent bystander. Thomas Waterhouse has more.
We're going to walk down.
He summoned, assembled and incited the mob which stormed the Capitol last month and then revelled in the violence which ensued. That's the crux of the prosecution's argument as Donald Trump's second impeachment trial continues. Referencing Shakespeare's play Hamlet, the Democrats' lead prosecution lawyer said that while the violence witnessed in Washington may have looked like chaos, there was method in the madness.
The evidence will show you that ex-President Trump was no innocent bystander. It will show that Donald Trump surrendered his role as commander-in-chief and became the inciter-in-chief of a dangerous insurrection.
Democrats have 16 hours to set out their stall as they try and show how Trump spent weeks encouraging his supporters to reject the results of November's presidential election and how he laid the groundwork for January's unrest. Senators were shown yet more clips of the riots, like this previously unpublished security camera footage. The chamber was also shown screenshot after screenshot of Trump's tweets and excerpts of his speeches.
And you have to get your people to fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them. It was part of a carefully planned, months-long effort with a very specific instruction. Show up on January 6th and get your people to fight the certification.
Unlike Trump's first impeachment trial in January last year, this one's expected to be wrapped up quickly. 67 votes are needed to convict the former president, meaning 17 Republican senators would need to defect and join the ranks of the Democrats.
In Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, the president, is hosting what is known as an all-Belarusian People's Assembly. This is the 6th time he's done this in the more than 26 years he's been in power. And it looks very much like he's celebrating victory over the protest movement that denounces his continued rule. Now, for more on all of that, we can cross to our correspondent in the region, Gulliver Cragg. Hi, Gulliver. Alexander Lukashenko really thinks he's won, but has he? What's your take on it?
Well, certainly opposition activists say that they are not giving up and that they expect renewed protests in the springtime. But a few months ago, when this all-Belarusian People's Assembly was first mooted, Alexander Lukashenko seemed to be under much, much stronger pressure. And there was talk that this assembly would deliver some kind of constitutional reform with perhaps at least some kind of a transfer of power to other bodies in a bid to try to satisfy the opposition. Today, it looks much more like He's just having a victory lap. There are green and red flags back all over the streets of Minsk. That's the official flag of the regime, as against the red and white flag that is the flag of the opposition. And if you look at videos of this All-Belarusian People's Assembly, it looks like a Soviet-style gathering with a huge amphitheater in which everyone's voting unanimously. And Alexander Lukashenko opened it with a speech saying, well, we kept our country so far. That's the language he uses, but we need to keep fighting. And he keeps talking about the idea of Belarus, his regime in Belarus, being under some kind of an attack from abroad rather than from its own people, unsatisfied with the election results. He did admit that maybe he didn't win the election by the 80% he claimed to have won it by last August, but maybe it was something like 68 or 74%. I don't know where he gets those figures from, but certainly he seems for the moment to be pretty satisfied. Protests in Belarus have died down. They're still going on, but with much, much smaller numbers. I think that's partly to do with fatigue, with no sense that anything's really changing, and Lukashenko is still determined to hold on to power. Partly it's, of course, to do with the winter and the cold weather, and partly, and sadly, it is the success of the very, very heavy-handed tactics used by the police against opposition activists. Human rights activists estimate that there are currently 246 political prisoners at the moment. Conditions in Belarusian jails are awful. There are very credible reports of people being systematically tortured and beaten when they're arrested by the police. That puts people off. There are also a lot of journalists who've been arrested, including the head of the Belarus Press Club, Yulia Slutskaya. I spoke to her deputy, who was in Warsaw, Poland, a few days ago, and she was in an absolutely grim mood. She thinks that the only thing that's really going to make this regime budge would be strong actions from abroad, strong sanctions against the regime, which would have to inflict also pain on the Belarusian people before things really changed.
Okay, so certainly creating the image of having won, and the optics very much going in that direction. But what do we know concretely, Gulliver, about the levels of support on the ground for Lukashenko and for the opposition?
Well, there's actually a new study that's just been published, carried out for the London-based think tank Chatham House, which suggests that there are a hardcore 37% of Belarusians who are protest supporters and very actively in favor of the protest movement. And then on top of that, 20% who are broadly sympathizers. So that gets you to over 50% of Belarusians in support of the opposition movement. At the other end of the spectrum, though, there are 18% that, according to this study, are hardcore supporters of Alexander Lukashenko. And then in the middle, you've got a lot of people who are indifferent or just very discouraged by the lack of change and not really inclined to think that these kinds of movements can get you anywhere, but not all that keen on Alexander Lukashenko either.
All right, Gulliver Cragg, thank you for that. Now, Greek restaurants and cafe owners have pleaded for additional government support to protect livelihoods after months of restrictions on their businesses due to the pandemic. Some 80,000 restaurants closed down in September. That put some 350,000 people out of work, apart from minimal home deliveries and takeaway services. To showcase their problems, restaurateurs collected the keys of their businesses and dropped them in boxes set up at a central square in Athens and in other Greek cities. They plan to hand those keys over to the Prime Minister's office in the coming days. Germany is to reopen schools and hairdressers in the coming weeks. The country's lockdown is to be extended until the 7th of March, however. Angela Merkel and the country's governors decided to leave in place aspects of the current lockdown that was due to expire on Sunday. This is due to a fear that new variants of the virus could cause further damage. Now, new testimonies of sexual abuse and rape have emerged at France's prestigious Sciences Po University in Paris and other political science universities around the country. Alleged victims have been speaking out since the head of Sciences Po Paris resigned over hushed allegations surrounding the head of the institution that manages a variety of political science schools. Olivier Duhamel was accused of raping his stepson in a tell-all book by another family member. That set in motion a Me Too-style wave of confessions. This report by our colleagues at France 3 with France 24's Shirley Sitbon.
Sciences Po universities exist in France's largest cities. They're considered as prestigious schools training France's elite. But in recent days, they've been under fire. Dozens of their students have said they've been sexually abused and that Sciences Po did nothing to help. Some say their schools even covered up sexual violence. Juliette says she was raped multiple times just as she integrated Sciences Po in Toulouse.
C'est un étudiant de deuxième année qui faisait partie des bureaux, qui donc me bisutait quand je suis arrivée à Sciences Po, qui m'a violée plusieurs fois dans le cadre de l'intégration. Et ce que je dénonce, c'est que cette intégration, ce bisutage, c'est ce processus de domination des deuxièmes années envers les premières années, mais aussi des hommes envers les femmes, ça produit ce genre de violence.
Lucas studies in another Sciences Po university. He too says he was raped and that no one acted to help.
Dites-lui. Parce que moi, j'ai pas la force d'en parler, mais dites-lui pour pas qu'il recommence, en fait, pour qu'il arrête. Au début, je suis vraiment comme ça, et en fait, personne n'a agi. Pendant 2 mois, personne n'a agi.
But things are changing. In recent days, dozens have denounced abuse, encouraged by a hashtag #SciencePor or #SciencePigs. It started after the director of Sciences Po Paris resigned. Frédéric Millon is accused of covering up sexual abuse allegedly carried out by Olivier Duhamel, once a respected political scientist and head of the National Foundation of Political Sciences. The case has pushed victims to denounce their attackers, to put an end to sexual violence, which is far more widespread than previously admitted.
All right, that's all for this bulletin. Thanks for watching France 24.
Les gens sont parfois, je dirais, ce que j'appelle la transphobie intériorisée, c'est-à-dire qu'ils ne se rendent pas compte que ce qu'ils disent est déplacé.
On est là pour l'aider et pour lui montrer à quel point sa différence est belle.
Les hommes et les femmes ne sont pas traités de la même manière dans la société dans laquelle on vit, et il n'y a pas d'exception pour les trans.
Welcome to a new edition. I'm Nadia Sharbi, and this week we're putting the focus on the country's transgender community. Here in France, some 80% of people who identify as transgender say they've been the target of discrimination and violence. A worrying figure that's just the tip of the iceberg for these men and women caught in a double bind of administrative, medical and social obstacles and their dire financial consequences. Let's start with the first-hand account of 2 transgender citizens.
20-year-old Bambi doesn't open up easily. Like many transgender women, she's constantly faced with harassment and violence on multiple levels.
In my everyday life, I experience transphobia through the looks I get, through people's confusion when I walk down the street. You face the possibility of being verbally assaulted, beaten up and humiliated in public, and it often happens. I don't know if I feel vulnerable, but at any rate, I feel like I have absolutely no protection.
Black transgender woman. Each of these words alone carries a backstory of oppression.
When you're a trans woman of colour, especially for me as a black woman, our femininity is constantly called into question.
The school environment is no different. To ease her transition, Bambi has taken a break from her studies in fashion. Ocean went through his transition as an adult. He understands that for young people experiencing the same thing, the risk of dropping out of their studies is never far.
Young people live with transphobia through school and university. They're misgendered. They haven't necessarily been able to change their first name, their identity papers. It's so distressing and difficult that they drop out. That's why we see fewer transgender graduates.
Ocean is the first French artist to publicly claim his trans identity.
Chère famille, je suis née assignée fille. Vous le savez peut-être ou peut-être pas, mais je n'ai jamais réussi à être parfaitement heureuse dans cette identité.
An actor, director and scriptwriter, he filmed his transition for over a year.
Comme je passe dans une autre catégorie, je serai un homme, je serai un homme, mais je serai un homme trans. Je ne serai pas un homme. Tu ne seras pas un homme, tu ne seras pas mon fils. Bah si. Non. Bah, je serai quoi alors? Tu seras trans.
In his documentary, he reminds us that transphobia is everywhere, even in the medical sphere.
With doctors, we're sort of at their mercy. With police, too. Everyone comments. Complete strangers come up to us to ask what we've got in our pants. It's as if our bodies were at other people's disposal. It's extremely intrusive and aggressive. Sometimes it can make us feel isolated, worried, or socially anxious.
Fighting against this widespread discrimination is part of Bambi and Ocean's daily lives. This means making their voices heard to raise awareness over and over again, explaining that transphobia is deadly. In 2019, 587 transphobic attacks were recorded in France, a figure which has more than doubled in just 1 year.
For more on how France treats its transgender community, I've come to meet sociologist Emmanuel Bobati, who's written extensively on this issue. Emmanuel, hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for being with us. And now, when discussing transgender issues, using the right words, names and pronouns is hugely important. Let's start with that word of transgender. In France, as elsewhere, it's come to replace the word transsexual. Why?
The word transsexual first appeared in the 50s in a medical context. From its inception, it was a clinical term. Then, in the 90s and 2000s, as a result of the trans community's activism, a new terminology started to emerge to take this condition out of the medical field and remove some of the stigma that goes with a medical approach. And that's how the idea of trans identity first appeared, as well as the shorthand trans and the word transgender, so the people in question could reclaim the words that describe their experience.
Now, the outcome of all these administrative, medical and social obstacles is that most transgender people face massive financial difficulties. How can that be addressed?
The cause of this financial hardship is mainly institutional. First, it comes from the number of difficulties in applying for a change of sex on France's civil registry. You need a number of testimonials and official documents, and the worst-off applicants simply don't have access to such proof, precisely because they depend on updated official documents to access things like work or a lease, so it's a vicious circle. Another instance is the medical assistance that's offered to trans people, both in France and elsewhere, because it's based on a psychiatric approach. Now, to access medical support, you have to go through a 2-year-long psych evaluation. So it's often during that lengthy waiting period that people face economic hardship, especially if they don't have job stability before they start transitioning, because finding a job during that transition process is almost impossible. So it's that lasting discrepancy between a person's gender expression through their pronouns and physical appearance and the gender recorded on their official documents that leads to such poverty.
Now, more often than not, the media, for instance, tend to focus more on transgender women rather than transgender men. Is that significant, or is their experience of transition the same?
Usually the transition experience for transgender men and women is very different and mostly comes down to how society responds to what I'd call their respective gender transgression. So when men start transitioning towards becoming a trans woman, they face immediate stigma and violence. Whereas in the case of a woman transitioning towards becoming a trans man, the social response is to downplay the situation, put it down to their being a tomboy, at least at first. As a result, data shows that poverty levels are higher for trans women than for trans men, and the latter also enjoy far more support from their loved ones, including their parents. So there's a clear difference depending on the gender you're transitioning to. That difference also translates in the age at which men and women begin the process. With transgender women, who are the target of a lot of violence from the onset, many give up on seeing the process through, temporarily at least, and try to fall in line and go back to living as men. Then they'll make the transition later in life, usually in their 50s. On the other hand, transgender men all make the transition in their mid-20s.
Well, the impetus for progress might actually come from an unlikely source, the country's youth. In the wake of a number of high-profile stories in the US, the question of transgender children has come to raise awareness here in France, most recently with the case of 8-year-old Lily and her fight for recognition.
8-year-old Lily is an energetic child from the south of France. But she hasn't always been so comfortable in her own skin. Lily was assigned as a boy at birth. Last year, she went through a bout of depression.
You used to shout a lot and cry at night.
Yes, I was angry.
So much so that her parents became increasingly alarmed.
One night she finally managed to tell us why she felt her life was so worthless and what she'd like to do to make it worth living. For us, it was a huge relief. At least we now know what makes her feel this way, so we'll do everything to make her feel better.
The first step for the family was to make their daughter's school accept her gender expression and her new name. Lily's school responded by sending a therapist to observe her in the classroom.
She's there to look at how much it makes me suffer when someone calls me by my old name.
And you found that hard?
Yes.
To avoid these kinds of painful experiences, France's education ministry has launched a working group to come up with guidelines for transgender issues. For Lily, her life is much easier since her school has accepted her chosen name and pronoun.
We're lucky with Lily, as she's proud of who she is. She wants to go to rallies and say it loudly. We're trans and we're allowed to exist. For us, it's made us think a lot about gender in general. Basically, we're here to help and show her that difference is beautiful. That she's beautiful.
Lily's parents reached out to LGBTQ+ charities to listen and learn, and to provide her with information as to not push her towards or away from medical interventions. They've signed her up at a Parisian clinic should she wish to take puberty blockers. But what's most important for the family now is to win a legal battle for the state to recognize her new name in official documents.
Emmanuel Bobatti, how is France doing in comparison to other Western nations on these issues?
Alors, elle se positionne pas à l'avant-garde, il faut le dire.
Let's be honest, France is far from being a leader on these issues. But to be fair, on the medical front, few countries offer a different approach. As a rule, it's still viewed as a psychiatric issue. However, on the key question of changing one's gender on official documents, some countries have instated a system that no longer involves a court of law. For instance, in Argentina, since 2012, people can change their sex on the country's civil registry by simply applying at the town hall. In France, you can change your first name at town hall, but the change of sex still has to go through the country's high courts.
Relève toujours du tribunal de grande instance.
Emmanuel Bobatti, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And with that, we leave this edition. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.
programme about women who are reshaping our world. We meet those who seek equality, be it in the boardroom or at the village well. The 51% brings you stories from across the globe about the women who are challenging the way we think.
The 51%, presented by Annette Young on France 24 and France24.com.
Take a new look at the news. Eyewitness accounts from those at the heart of the action, all over the world. Exclusive videos you've never seen before, all verified by our journalists.
The Observers, presented by Derek Thompson on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello, you're watching live from Paris. I'm James Creedon. This is 1 p.m. lunchtime here in Paris, and here are our headlines. Myanmar's population continues to protest against last week's military coup, with several ethnic minorities now joining those crowds. Joe Biden has announced sanctions against the regime, and Myanmar's leader has urged civil servants to return to work. Lots of developments in Myanmar. We'll bring you up to speed on all of that at the top of the show. Donald Trump's impeachment trial is underway in the United States with video and audio files played by prosecution on Wednesday. They're aiming to demonstrate the former president incited the mob that besieged the US Capitol on the 6th of January. More on that coming up. And the Haitian police have fired tear gas on hundreds of protesters marching against President Jovenel Moïse in Port-au-Prince. Journalists were also attacked in those latest clashes. More on that later on in the show. Now, for the 6th straight day, demonstrators in Myanmar are braving a government ban on gatherings of more than 4 people. They continue to protest against the country's military coup and demand a return of Aung San Suu Kyi and her ruling party. The demonstrations come after another wave of arrests in the country and amid fears amongst activists that further state repression could be coming. We can cross now to Philip Sherwell for more on all of that. Philip, the military has been speaking just now in the last while. What have they been saying? Tell us the latest.
Yes, the Military Information Service has just released a new statement by the coup leader, Min Aung Hlaing. He has been urged. So there's not only these massive street protests that you're referring to, but there's this civil disobedience movement where government employees are staying away from work. They're trying to bring the workings of the bureaucracy to a halt, and this is really having some quite serious impacts on how the junta is able to govern. So the coup leader has issued a statement tonight urging government workers to return to work. He said that unscrupulous persons are causing their absences. He's implying that dark forces, overseas forces are interfering in the country. Now, this is coming from a military leader who's just seized power in a coup because he claimed there was electoral fraud when Aung San Suu Kyi won a landslide victory in the November election. So, you know, it's causing dismay and despair and disbelief in Burma that he could be making these claims. We've also seen a real intensity of raids on people associated with Aung San Suu Kyi, close allies, ethnic leaders, parliamentarians. There's been a lot more arrests overnight. And the government has also released or circulated to internet companies a very tough new cyber law that is going to basically make illegal any communications that they deem to be risking the country's stability and national security. And they're going to require internet companies, telecoms providers, to actually flag that information. It's causing huge concern for those telecoms business, some of them foreign owned. So the government is trying to intimidate people back to work. It's arresting people, and it's threatening a cyber crackdown.
OK, and a lot of curiosity as well about how the international community, China, Russia, are going to react to this, the pressure from the outside. We're seeing now the Biden administration has said it will slap sanctions on Myanmar. Is that likely to change anything, Philip?
Yeah, the Myanmar military, when they were operating as a dictatorship previously, had very heavy sanctions on them. It really didn't affect their behaviour for very visibly. I mean, they may eventually have sort of kind of reached a compromise with the democracy movement because of sort of the impact of sanctions on certain fronts. But
Philip, can I ask, what about the effects on the people on the ground? These sanctions really, they do affect the population quite significantly, don't they?
Yes, so the sanctions last time were quite broad, and there was a feeling that because the military is so involved in business, if you sanction the military, you're actually hitting a lot of economic activity. And there was a feeling that people, the regular people in a very impoverished country were suffering too. So the focus this time is going to be on targeted sanctions. Joe Biden is talking about military leaders and looking at military conglomerates, but it's very difficult to disentangle the military's business web from the general economy. China and Russia will not join in those sanctions. China is the largest trading partner. Russia is supplying arms. So it's not an easy sort of weapon to use against the military in Myanmar. It may have some effect. It's not going to have a crushing effect on them.
Philip Sherwell, Sunday Times Asia correspondent. Thank you for talking to us on France 24.
Thank you.
Now, the US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have held their first telephone call as leaders in what was a tense exchange. Biden insisted on a free and open Indo-Pacific as a priority for his administration. According to the White House, other points emphasised were concern over the crackdown in Hong Kong, reported human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and increasingly assertive actions in the region, in particular towards Taiwan. Xi Jinping, for his part, warned the US president that confrontation between the two countries would be a disaster for both. He told Biden the two sides should re-establish the means to avoid, quote, misjudgments. That according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry's account. The trial of the former US President Donald Trump is now well underway in the Senate. He's the first former leader to face an impeachment trial after leaving office. He's been charged with incitement of insurrection for allegedly encouraging his supporters to storm the Capitol building on the 6th of January. Now, during the first full day of arguments yesterday, prosecutors said that the evidence shows Donald Trump was no innocent bystander. Thomas Waterhouse has more.
We're going to walk down.
He summoned, assembled and incited the mob which stormed the Capitol last month and then revelled in the violence which ensued. That's the crux of the prosecution's argument as Donald Trump's second impeachment trial continues. Referencing Shakespeare's play Hamlet, the Democrats' lead prosecution lawyer said that while the violence witnessed in Washington may have looked like chaos, there was method in the madness.
The evidence will show you that ex-President Trump was no innocent bystander. It will show that Donald Trump surrendered his role as commander-in-chief and became the inciter-in-chief of a dangerous insurrection.
Democrats have 16 hours to set out their stall as they try and show how Trump spent weeks encouraging his supporters to reject the results of November's presidential election and how he laid the groundwork for January's unrest. Senators were shown yet more clips of the riots, like this previously unpublished security camera footage. The chamber was also shown screenshot after screenshot of Trump's tweets and excerpts of his speeches.
And you have to get your people to fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them. It was part of a carefully planned, months-long effort with a very specific instruction. Show up on January 6th and get your people to fight the certification.
Unlike Trump's first impeachment trial in January last year, this one's expected to be wrapped up quickly. 67 votes are needed to convict the former president, meaning 17 Republican senators would need to defect and join the ranks of the Democrats.
Haitian police have fired tear gas on hundreds of protesters marching against President Jovenel Moïse in Port-au-Prince. Journalists were also attacked in those latest clashes. The protesters accuse Moïse of illegally extending his term in office, which they say should have ended last weekend. Alexander Okot has more.
A radio station's pickup truck engulfed in tear gas, and other journalists having to apply first aid to each other. As protests continue to grow, Haitian police have been accused of a violent crackdown that even targeted clearly identified members of the press. Tensions are rising in Haiti as people continue to call for President Jovenel Moïse to step down. Opponents argue that his presidential term officially ended on Sunday.
Depuis avant 7 février, situation était grave et après 7 février, côté président perdu toute légitimité et mandat fini, situation vient plus grave et dictature vient plus dure.
President Moïse argues, however, that he was sworn in for a 5-year term in 2017, so he still has until 2022 to stay in office. The United States has backed this position, though its embassy has released a statement saying it is deeply concerned about any actions that risk damaging Haiti's democratic institutions. On Sunday, officials loyal to the president claimed to have foiled a bid to murder him in a coup and arrested 23 people, including a Supreme Court judge. And on Tuesday, Moïse tried to force out 3 other judges who were put forward as potential interim national leaders by the opposition.
Now, new testimonies of sexual abuse and rape have emerged at France's prestigious Sciences Po University in Paris and other political science universities around the country. Alleged victims have been speaking out since the head of Sciences Po